again, I really appreciate clearly the level of participation at the lunch and conversations and the quality of the discourse that followed. And we look forward to continuing that discourse throughout the day and tomorrow morning. Our next event is to hear from one of our colleagues, Christy Edmonds. Kristy is, I think, in my mind, first and foremost, is an artist. Secondly, a curator, artistic director, and frequent consultant, recognized for innovation and depth in the presentation of contemporary art. Under her leadership since May 1st, 2011, UCLA's venerated performing arts program has evolved to become Center for the Art of Performance, known as CAP UCLA. In the past, Kristy was the founding and executive artistic director of the Portland Institute for Contemporary Art, PICA, and the TBA Festival in Portland, Oregon. She was the artistic director of the Melbourne Festival, and she worked as the consulting artistic director for the newly formed Park Avenue Armory in New York. Again, her career has included work as a visual artist, an independent filmmaker, a playwright, a choreographer, and a teacher. And for me, she has been an inspiration, a good friend, and a partner in realizing shared visions for the field. Kristy will talk to us for a period of time, 25 minutes, half hour, and then we'll be happy to take questions from the floor. Let me introduce to you Christy Edmonds.
Okay. Anyone who works with Sam Miller would know that when you agree to do something, what you thought you were agreeing to has morphed into something entirely other. And you absolutely know somehow you'll be better for it. And this is one such moment I shall share with you. I think a lot in the discussions today, and for colleagues who are on the live broadcast, please feel free to tweet in and bring up questions and that kind of thing. But I feel both need and a sense of strength from talking to the people in this room. This is a room of people that are full of illustrious colleagues, inspiring in their own right. And when we think of ourselves collectively, we manifest and we uphold the integrity of a massive cultural portfolio in the US, in our cities, communities, in the country, as well as the elongated kind of portfolios that expand around the world. That portfolio moves into the past, it moves into the present, and hopefully it sets the tenor of a purposeful intent around human heritage that we can't really own, nor collect, nor preserve in the ways that we might like to. But we can imbue it with a profound resonance, the permanent collection of things that are most ephemeral, that stand in the resilience of our sense of value and belonging, our sense of leadership and our sense of dreaming, our sense of liberty, and our sense of creative radicalism. So this is a group of people in the room. I was thinking about it when the panel was speaking earlier about the distinctions or the connective tissue between artist-centric curation when you're working in the visual arts as opposed to or in harmony with the performing arts. And one of the things that I started thinking about in relation to the Institute for Curatorial Practice and Performance is that there is a very large distinction to be made between the artistic practice that becomes embodied inside of an object and where it sits at the time that that artist has created it and made it fire, whether culture is ready for it or not, right? There's a way to revisit that in a different way. In performance, however, you're dealing with the absolute here and now of the human body who in song, in movement, in provocation through text or words or a variety of other things, we don't have the same kind of chance, possibly, to revisit it later when we have a chance to have caught up to the initial offer of that gesture from an artist. There is a singular difference between how one tends to the integrity of that vision and that work and that gift into the cultural commons and into our heritage lines that requires them right then. You know, we're not shipping and crating and freighting. We're on airlines with our bodies, in bad hotels often, and a variety of other kinds of things. And I think there's a huge distinction about how then do we actually work well in that, in being in carriage of that, but also how do we transmit knowledge and experience through that helps others do that integrity, the integrity of that work as well. But one thing with the center, or the Institute, is that there's something else that happens inside of it, and it relates predominantly to probably how I'll weave all of my anecdotal thoughts into something that hopefully is useful. And it has to do with actually our profession. Our profession itself, as presenters or curators or producers or managers or artist interlocutors or so on and so forth, is a professional practice that is perhaps even more ephemeral to understand than the art forms that we invest in, protect, uphold, provoke, or try and be in possession of. The way we learn about the way in which different individuals have changed or authored institutions in live performance practice, or in presenting institutions, or in performing arts centers, or in kind of avant-garde spaces, or cafes, or whatever, which make up the network of possibility in our professions, is not something that we actually know well in an encyclopedic fashion. And many of you who are sitting in here are the very people who taught me how it would be that I would take on a life as a kind of artistic director and curator, coming from the realm of being an artist and sort of falling into a situation in which I would be running an organization or a program within an organization. I learned because there was an investment of someone, many of you are in the room, who of another generational moment saw something in me that said, yes. And that's not exactly a tool that I could assemble an entire thing on. Do you know what I mean? But it's actually how this has happened. It's happened in our profession that people who have a lot of professional experience and history and a variety of knowledge and expertise see something in another individual and say, we need you in here, which doesn't mean you know what to do, but it means you're given something that I think is essential and very, very meaningful. It gives you a sense of looking through the lens of being confident without having an ego. And in that confidence, you begin to migrate towards accepting the challenges of different forms of leadership in often very elliptical ways in order to honor the fact that you were affirmed. And I think at the center, that's one of the big, or at the Institute at ICPP, one of the things that we really had talked about before going into it, and with Sam, and I just want to dwell on it a little bit as part of this because it lays some context. If the majority of how we learn in our profession is through the somewhat random and haphazard chance encounter, that someone saw something in you and lobbed you a ball with the belief that you would pick it up and wherever and part of the country or world you are in, do something significant with it, is a mode of professional endeavor training, right? There's a lot that might be able to be done with how we transfer that knowledge. And that was really what the aggregation of this was. How do we, now that we have actually established, and in many ways across successive generations, authored a field of a profession. We call it a field. I often think of a grassy knoll, but you know, it's a professional practice. It's a profession. It has a code of ethics. It has a code of behavior. It has a variety of other kinds of things that imbue it with the standard of what it means to be a profession. And I think that one of the things that has really been sought is how can we best transfer knowledge so that the idea that these, I mean, one thing is absolutely inevitable. We will all not be here forever. And the portfolio of not only real estate, but performing arts heritage, the lineage of knowing, the experiences of leadership, the investment in cultural commons, and the really significant ability to work deeply with artists so that the integrity of their vision and explorations continue to move towards communities in ways that help them fire or feel confident inside of their curiosity. That these kinds of things will pass. So where do we find a place in which people who are seeking to know what it is that we do might have a way of doing that outside of an hour-and-a-half conference session or the lobbing of a ball towards you because you had some ingredient potential? And that's really what this is. It's not really, the ICP was not invented in a way that was about how do we create perfect, holistic utopia for all at all times, but how do you take the corner of something and give it a depth and resonance of being able to be a place in which the transfer of great good knowledge that is still in practice and still evolving can fire and find inquiry, interest, and another generation's approach towards being able to do this work. I often think when we talk about capacity building in performing arts, which I've heard a lot today, when I think of capacity building, I remember first trying to think of capacity building in relation to how it would, how you fill out a grant form. This is earlier in my career. And I've come over time to really think that what capacity building is now is the capacity in which you feel like you can absolutely vacate and move on to something else that life might pull you towards, because the legacy of the aspects of what artists have done inside an organization or inside of your community or wherever will be uptaken by another, not at all in the same way as you. In fact, hopefully not in the same way as you, but with new tools, new tenets, new moments, new needs, new urgencies, new speeds, that the value system that sits inside of that has its resilience. That the sustaining, when we talk about sustaining, it's sustaining that as opposed to the sustaining of the real estate that you've been able to occupy for a certain period of time. So at any rate, there's a variety of things that have been coming up today and coming across in my mind as I think about how to say something that might be relevant or it might be useful. And one of those things is that we know that we are living in absolutely exponential times. I work right now in a university environment which gives me the great honor and opportunity to be in contact with 18 to 24-year-olds on a regular basis. In certain fields of their study, by the time they hit their sophomore year, what they were taught in their freshman year will become slightly obsolete. By the time they graduate, what they learned in their second year will no longer apply. There's the statistical knowledge that we have that, in fact, in many regards, some of the most sought-after professions in the world didn't even exist in 2004. You know, this is exponential change, and our culture feels it. And the pressure that sits above our profession in this moment, to me, is one that I think we need to really spend time finding ways to evoke and challenge. One of the big pressures that sits on us is that we can watch that in our cultural leadership, there's a huge amount of, well, I'll say it with redundancy, pressure to decorate mediocrity to the point that it can just pass as an imposter of excellence. That it allows a kind of building of illiteracy around the human belonging to art and its practice, its process, and its provocations, because it tricks people into being able to think that complacency, if decorated just enough, is enough to stand in for outrage, curiosity, and a variety of other things that are critical to our ability to feel connected and progressing in a variety of ways. Our profession and our job as curators is to absolutely work in the high-risk enterprise of actually pursuing and exploring the extraordinary to see if excellence can emerge from it. Not excellence in a way of refinement necessarily, but excellence in terms of how it provokes culture to feel awake to the moment that we are occupying in the time period that we're occupying. I feel like the difference between the purely, the approach I think that we take as curators in this work, it's not to be more and more refined, or more and more academic, or more and further into the rabbit hole of some particular fascination. It's actually about standing very, I loved how Thomas said it, that way of standing very close to an artist, where you can you're as close to what that pursuit is, which is usually a pursuit of an unknown outcome, because if an artist knows the outcome, the likelihood of them engaging it is very small. If you already know what's going to happen when you do the thing, the likely need to do the thing is just labor. But instead, the pursuit of an unknown outcome that you stand right next to find where its energy resides, its scholarship, its knowledge, its ambition, all of these different things, and then from that place, protect the soul of that idea inside of that human being against the pressures of the institutional frames that utterly are driven towards needing the absolute outcome way in advance, right? So often I think that when we're doing that curatorial work, it's about caring about the art forms themselves. It's about caring knowledgeably inside of a community, which is always a series of communities, which is always a series of individuals within communities, so that you're tilling the soil to set the condition for an idea that can be provoking, and I mean provocative towards the sublime, provocative to an awakeness to beauty, provocative to checking biases, provocative to our sense of reconnecting with outrage that is not really helpful to suppress. That any of those kinds of things are what you're actually working to do, so that that framing that Philip Byther speaks of, or Judy speaks of, that framing is connected to building a bridge and a ladder towards all the different possibilities of that. And I think that many of us in our curatorial work with artists, and I think many artists, it's also about wanting very much inside of an audience to give a gift of a kind of resilience for when you move back into your regular life and face the headwinds of whatever that is. Increasingly, I think, the headwinds of data and administrivia, which are also part of our curatorial language. When I was starting, when I came to UCLA, and the organization at the time was called UCLA Live, one of the things that I was confronted with right away was a name change. You know, would we change the name? And it was very interesting. I always feel skeptical of working in organizations if the word art somehow doesn't feature inside of what it is. And so UCLA Live, which many people pronounced in their mind UCLA Live, which given the budget of California at the time was a serious concern. You know, they thought it was a branding exercise for the university to live on. And so when the name change came up, I had thought to myself, and I'd worked with the administration to say, you know, is it possible for us to embed a public promise inside of the name? And so the name is Center for the Art of Performance at UCLA, and that's what it actually means. We'll be centered on the art of performance. How and what those are in the entertainment capital of planet, world, Earth, you know, has its own little tensions here and there, but I quite like them. But really, I've learned over time, and even in that thing, can we shift the name towards a public promise? Can a brand be informed by some aesthetic integrity? Can there be more to it? Can it be hard to say? Can it be hard to say? So that it, you know, the shorter we get, the more paragraphs it takes to explain. So sometimes the longer the name, the less the paragraphs that follow. Well, at least that was my tactical strategy at the time. But it's very much using the scholarship of a university, using the incredible scholarship of artists, using the real estate of a massive public institution, using the knowledge of other kinds of fields of inquiry and endeavor to come to bear on problematizing and advancing and getting behind very, very highly diverse experiences in art forms as authored and generated by artists. You know, that's really what the center is doing. So I've created a whole bunch of programs and a variety of other things that we can talk about if you guys are interested in it. But getting back to some of, you know, the aspects of today, one of the things that I think is really important in moving over to ICPP and what it means now to have a master's degree taking form and taking shape. And I think it's interesting. It's not, importantly, about how does a university utilize a new degree as an economic instrument for tuition. It's actually how does a university hold in possession a degree that enables the transfer of knowledge to be able to be moved from academics and practitioners across a lot of different latitudes so that we are absolutely working and tending to the idea that mediocrity, dressed up, is not actually the pursuit of the form, that the path of least resistance is not the pursuit of the form, that the box office is not the singular measure for the value of attendance, and that instead a fundamental investment in an audience and in an artist to be in a moment of extreme belonging can take place. So this is very much what it is and very much what we're doing. And I know that we're going to have a chance for questions, but I just want to see if anybody's starting to fire with any at all. One of the things that I think is also worth stating is that I was working in Australia for a number of years, and in Australia you see also the resource base that allows organizations and artists in a variety of to come together, not at zero, but at like 60%. That fundraising and the seeking of other additional investment is that you can lift and try and get that margin higher. And here, and coming back into the US, it's really, you start at zero and you try and fire in every which way that you can to find the aspects of resourcing for the various things that I'm talking about. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I think it's also very significant, is that we face the pressure constantly of having to justify in advance often what we will be able to succeed with, right? The advanced prediction of success is a false guarantee. There's not like a money-back guarantee that an idea will succeed and that the success metrics matters more than the integrity of the offer or the gift inside of a community or inside of an artist. And I think that that's one of the biggest things that I've been looking at and grappling with is, do we actually, where do we find the ways to not just be trained with the fundamental belief that great managerial prowess will execute vision, right? Can we manage or administrate the vision? That's part of something, but it's not the end-all be-all, and it's not the whole. So it's one of those things where we're seeing over and over and over coming into our field a tremendous amount of very refined capacities with Excel spreadsheets, very refined capacities around marketing strategies, very refined capacities around the use of data and trend lines to enforce greater degrees and margins of success prediction. And what is success to us? It's not the success of how we fundamentally find the vehicles through which to extract more or everything out of everything. It's the models of where the seeking of, well, the model that we seek in our field is not that to refine further degrees of extraction. It's to find the models through which replenishment is put in. How do we actually create those kinds of advanced predictions that enable replenishment into the cultural commons, into a shared heritage lines, into artistic provocation? How do we actually do that? It's not to extract, it's to invest. Our shareholders are, in fact, not looking for us to make additional degrees of profit to our institutional imprimatur. It's actually to author and uphold the integrity of a mission. So institutions, I think, are also one of those places. We also know with the millennials and the people coming up, that they fundamentally have moved away from a trust and belief in an institution. And why is it? Institutions tend to refine self-preservation on a lot of managerial and administrative lines. My curatorial practice is actually in working with artists boldly and with colleagues to go into institutional frames and say the institution is a creative medium and artistic ideas have the right to also reanimate the rhetoric that you're rendering null and void in order to actually make those words continue to retain meaning so that another generation can believe that the upholding of that promise is also meant for them. So as we go into the next chapters and stages and everything of this conference, and we think about what is the knowledge that we most need from one another in order to do the thing that we do, the things that we do collectively, what are those pieces that are not success predictions around what we've started to adopt, but the reauthoring of what it actually means? When you look up the word curator or curate in the dictionary and find the Latin root of it, many of you guys know it, do you know? You guys are some students. I remember saying this in one of my classes. When you look it up, the curate in Latin, it means the protector of the soul of something, a given something, right? In the iteration, it was biblical, so it must have been the book. But that to me is the fundamental job description. The job description is not the Excel spreadsheet. It's a tool within a matrix. The job description is actually how best to uphold the soul of a given something, which in our case is the ephemeral and extraordinary life of the possibility of what artists make and do as a singular gift into our heritage. And when we know there's capacity in a generation that follows us, we move on and we step away. And the number of people who have come to bear on starting this is another way of building capacity for that very transference, whether they be from academic frames or different fields of study or our profession. That is what we're here to do. So it's incredibly important that we hear from you about what kinds of things are needed inside of the kind of curriculum, the ideas, and so on and so forth, so that when we have the question of wanting to have knowledge transported, we know where to go, right? One of the things that my grandfather, and I'll share this in a minute because there were a couple of topics that came up at the table and around the room as we've been going, but I've been thinking about my grandfather a very great deal. He was an engineer. He was extraordinary with trigonometry, and he articulated that knowledge by building bridges, truly building bridges over various rivers so that people could get from point A to point B. And he had this elaborate system of tools in his kind of shed, man shed, as it were, that were perfectly organized and knolled on the walls. And and I coveted them. I thought they were fascinating. I absolutely loved them, and I had no idea what you would do with these things. And he knew that those tools would be absolutely obsolete. He knew that those tools would be obsolete to my use, and that the idea that he would hand that to me would be a kind of handing over of memorabilia, perhaps, but that I would actually not be able to use them. We live in exponential times. The tools we have now, we won't be able to hand over from the knolled wall of everything that we've done, except for one, and it's the ethic of work and a persistence of integrity around what we believe in how we find access to knowing one another. Thank you. Okay, so let's now talk together about things on our mind, or Colleen, yeah. So here's the mic.
So the whole notion of when, and think Judy said this, and my mother always made this statement, we stand on the shoulders of those who come before us.
Yes.
So the shoulders you stood on at UCLA sort of built the program where it was, created that title. How do you bring in a community's value of what it was before to something they don't quite know yet is going to be?
Yeah. Hopefully everybody got that question. When I came into, UCLA has something that I think is very extraordinary. It has a 75-year history now of active performing arts presentation. It has gone through a variety of iterations. UCLA Committee for the Presentation of the Fine Arts, a variety of other iterations, UCLA Presents, then UCLA Live, now Center for the Art of Performance. To me, what's been really interesting, and I think I was slow a little bit at the uptake when I first got there, one was that a certain kind of, I could look through the past practices, and there were certain kinds of things that had fallen off. And one of those things that had fallen off was the attendance of the student body. There was somewhere around 1% of the students, and I think the campus undergrad population is something like 58,000. So we're talking about, a significant size community that the performing arts program had now either turned its back on or had found other, or the pressure of earned income had meant that they had been left behind. A variety of possibilities. I didn't need to know which one. I just need to know that there was a gap. And really, and when you think about it, for those of us, maybe if you grew up in Manhattan, had very progressive parents who frequently took you to experience contemporary artists or contemporary work or traditional work or conventional work or work of any kind in the arts, then you probably had a certain literacy of experience as you came in. But for the majority of us who didn't have that, the first encounter that you often will have with that sort of mind-blowing, expansive moment happens at university. So if 1% of the campus population of students was coming, right, then that would be an area. To me, I can look at it and go, well, economically, that's not so much of a problem. Politically, that might be a problem. It's certainly odd. You can look at it from a lot of angles, which I tend to elliptically do. But to me, what it meant was that one of the singular things of strength that the organization, the center, could do would be to re-impact a generation that also has no longer had arts in its public school curriculum now for their entire generation, their entire public education. That being able to put that gift back in front of their interest and uptake would be a very significant gesture. And that also affects programming, right? It affects programming a lot. So in the wake of that, the predominating audiences were, UCLA is surrounded by very wealthy communities. A lot of the students commute from a long distance to get onto the campus. A lot of students live on the campus, so on and so forth. But the diversity of who could come, who was in its belongings, so on and so forth, was very high. So I knew that the student population and the campus scholars and academics and workers would be a major part of how I would renovate the audience. And it doesn't therefore mean that you push the audience that has occupied the seats out, but you begin a conversation of inclusion around why. And that, for sure, has happened. It's vastly more diverse in every way, shape, and form that we mean that. And while there were certainly people who did not understand, it's like, where's my Bach, where's my Beethoven, where's my Vivaldi, and things like that, I was saying, very commandingly done downtown at the LA Philharmonic, and extraordinarily well developed over with the UCLA Philharmonia, and a variety of other places where that access point would be, right? But to create redundancy because it was known. Redundancy of great offer because it's already known would have meant I bypassed a responsibility that I had in jazz, in contemporary dance, in international theater, in a variety of theater forms, in spoken word, generationally, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't mean that I abandoned anyone, but it meant that I had to have a very, very different kind of discussion around why. the why of the programming. And it was an audience at the time that was very used to looking around, like many do, looking around the venue, which is 1,800 seats, and if they saw some emptiness in those seats, then they assumed that they had perhaps also made the wrong decision. Things like that. And so it really became a conversation around what is the integrity of the mission, the art forms, and how do we intersect with those in significant ways. And that has been a huge part of that journey. Also moving people, so I created a residency program that works a lot with local artists and national and international. That program became a really important component part, and it signified to a board, this wasn't just about, going around shopping the planet and then affording to present the work, but actually being deeply invested in the evolution of those ideas, in artists being able to confront the vulnerability of their ideas without the pressure of a stage and a public right away, and a variety of other ways that you do that. Master artists who don't need access so much to studio space, but need and desire access to another generation of thinkers, and a deep craving to transfer aspects of their own knowledge, hopefully in useful ways, that can be taken up differently. So we created a fellows program there. Special collections, a variety of other things. So it has moved it truly into a kind of Kunsthalle for the live performance in its portfolio, rather than it being a presenter that extracts the ticket sales from the neighborhood surrounding, but instead builds a bridge and a pathway where they weren't to a broader community. Yeah, that was an incredibly long answer. I hope I still have a job out there later. Kathy Edwards.
Thanks for that great talk. I wanted to ask about a couple of the words you used. Replenishment, which I thought was a beautiful word. You contrasted that with extraction, which seems potent and powerful to me. I'm kind of wondering a little bit if you can talk a little bit more about replenishment. And then the second word is gift. Gift almost seems a little more complicated to me. So, when I think of a gift of, an artwork and receiving, I wonder if there's a kind of reciprocity that's involved in gift making. Oh, tell me more about how art is a gift. I mean, I like it in one sense, but I want to understand a little bit more what else is involved with that, especially as it relates to, the professional practice of the curator.
Okay, I'm going to try, but
thank you.
I can feel that there's a trap, slightly. No, I'm kidding. So you might have to say more. I'm kidding. I love you. I guess I'll start with this sense of gift, right? In my experience of working with artists is really the predominating part of the majority of my life, right? And there's not been an artist that I have ever worked with who is not endeavoring to have the work that they're manifesting be given away, right? That doesn't mean an economic instrument. We need the resource exchange to be able to continue functioning. That's not what I mean. But I mean that it's a gift of a kind of expressive truth, or it's a gift of a kind of it's an offering of a way in which the human imagination can be valued beyond its ability to create a commodity. And whether that is a gift that is sent into the cultural commons or our communities to grab us by the throat and shake us to a state of awakeness, it's still a gift. It's a gift to be awake to the world that comes through an unusual, often underknown form, right? So that to me as a curator is something that I tend to try and keep an audience somewhat focused on, right? That the economic piece of it, the ticket exchange, that a variety of other kinds of things are part of a resourcing complexity. But it's not a singular value, right? And that sense of desiring to move the resource of your time, your attention, and your wallet in service to the possibility of that experience is a gift exchange, actually. rather than an acquisition. But the acquisition, in some way, like, we can't own a performance, right, in the way you can own a painting. So to me, what's really interesting is that it leaves us, therefore, with being able to be in possession. We can possess a performance, and we can act as an audience as if we are the permanent collection of the life of that idea in that time, in that moment, that we are the living archive of that exchange, which is vastly different than saying, I liked it, or was it worth the money or was it not? That there's a gift, that there's an offering to be made from an audience, and the more repetition of exposure to the concept or thought or possibility of that idea, the leaning forward comes differently, and the critique without actual literacy starts to diminish because you're building it, but building it through a sense of being in shared possession of a gift of the possibility of that imaginative moment, giving its highest and best to the possibility of that moment. So that's what I mean, I suppose, when I talk about gift. When I talk about extraction and replenishment. You know, a lot of us in one way or another, you'll eventually go through it when you move from being a cafe worker to a variety of things, and then you end up running an institution. You intersect with leadership training. And it often comes from business schools at universities. And it's not that I don't think that that is extremely valuable. It's, I feel privileged to be able to sometimes see and think of how that world operates. But the training of business executives and executive leadership in the arts do tend to have different kinds of, conundrums. And one of the things that I've started to really think about and see and look at is the absolute incredible sophistication that is being developed in models to generate aspects of willingness to pay ratios that can then squeeze out a slight more advantage to the resource investment. You see what I mean? And I think about it. How much can we possibly learn how to sell? We will eventually learn how to sell absolutely everything that there ever was. Think about it. The air, biology, genes, think of it. We will figure out a way to monetize absolutely everything. And when you do it, the pressure is to, or the success metric is connected to how much more can you extract. And so when I think of like, should I raise ticket prices, or should I this, or I think about where that extraction is and who therefore has access, and what kinds of ways do I create a democracy of purpose in which resourcing is a responsible part of a gift exchange inside of it, but it isn't about how I squeeze more from a certain area. How do I extract more? I think about our business models in the arts, which necessarily exist to be good stewards of the economy that we are earning and contributing. That the reason that economy and resource is there is to generate replenishment. How do we use our resources to put in while many other forces in culture are pulling out? And I think our lament is that we can't quite keep up. We can't keep up with enough. We're putting in constantly, trying to put it in, replenish, provide the tools of resilience against extraction, while others are hyper-professionalizing layers and layers and layers of extraction. I guess that's sort of what I meant. I hope I still have a job. Yeah. Yes. Hang on.
Kathy's point, and I do think there's a real danger in gift and kind of, because we're in a time of debt, so the references to the commons are really helpful. At the same time, we're all concerned with an undercommons that, Moten and Harney are theorizing, this idea that we're constantly in debt. And I wonder, for those of us who are in academic institutions, there's a way that our work in relationship to these 18 to 24-year-olds, which is terrific, is also trying to answer this debt that they have. They were born into it whether they wanted it or not. So there's kind of, I don't know, I think there's a real danger in thinking of gift as opposed to obligation. and kind of ethical responsibility. Because Mauss's theorizing of the gift, of course, means that we're all privileged enough to be able to just share. And we're in such an asymmetrical kind of world. I mean, there's nothing symmetrical about who gets to be at a performance. So the idea that we're all archiving the performance is terrific, but at the same time, we can't all be in the room. So, you know, I know you know these things, but I wish you could you speak a little bit more with particularity in terms of asymmetries around curating, the center, the possibilities of performance, and especially this idea of debt that's really, I think, overwhelming the possibility of gift.
I think you should probably talk more about all those things. I got a feeling you're going to have a lot more knowledge about all of those things than I do. But when I use the term gift, it's in the context of generosity, okay? It's not in the context of privilege, right? So being able to use, you know, your whole self with some kind of integrity is a privilege. Behaving as privileged is something other altogether, right? So when I think about that sense of gift, I'm meaning it in a kind of poetic symbolism frame, as opposed to perhaps its absolutely refined possible symbiosis to another word. But it does have an attachment to me that generosity is an obligation. And generosity is actually about using your whole self and those capacities with whatever means you have in you in service to something other. Not just, I got a little bit extra here, here you go. When you talk about debt, this to me is part of what caused me to want to go into UCLA, a public research university, which also happens to have a hell of a lot of patents. Anyway, and think about that. The level of tuition paid, even in a public university, which is an ethos. You know, I run also Royce Hall. I have to rent Royce Hall, right, from the university that I work in, and all these kinds of elaborate systems. But what's interesting about it is that you it gives you a chance to also sit and say, okay, well, this is, you know, accounting refinement in a variety of ways. However, was the intention of the original founder builders of this place that 100 years later we would be using it as an economic instrument? Or was it actually built as a hall of public assembly in which the transfer of knowledge for betterment was made publicly accessible and symbolized that people coming together in a hall of public assembly is where those things take place? It's not like we're paying down a mortgage, right? So when I think of the students, I also think of how do they have access to that hall? How do they have access to that hall in a way in which it was actually intended to be used? The transfer of knowledge through the arts inside of, you know, public assembly. Students now, certainly, and this has been increasing over time, is that their futures are often mortgaged, right? I was teaching a course, Peter Sellers' course, it's called Artists' Social Action. And in teaching Peter's course, I knew that while I may not be the greatest teacher on the planet, that I would learn a great deal from the perspectives of these students. And I had them do weekly journal entries. There were about 200 students in this. What was very interesting is that I asked them, in the you know, as they confront debt, as they look at the future being mortgaged, and as they seek the greatest speed and efficiency through which they can get through an academic, that the academic refinement often in these institutions has forgotten a singular important thing about that aspect of a journey of life. It is about the process of becoming. And the way that these students reflected on confronting a future debt at a public university, not even private, public, obligation, generous obligation towards education as a fundamental ethos of something, right? What did they feel was most at risk for them in the pursuit of efficiency of getting through as fast as possible? And I asked them to write about it. And 60% of them said they felt that what was most at risk for them was their curiosity. It was a luxury they could not afford. How do we behave from our field generously into that future without just lobbing the ball? How do we do that? It's a practice. We're learning to learn. Sam, I think you're cutting me off at the knees up here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kristy, for that gift. I am forever in your debt. Sorry, Tommy, about that. So now we'll take another break, and then we will have the table spokespersons from tables 5, 6, 7, and 8 join Lydia at the table to continue this conversation. Thanks so much.